On the issue of illegal immigration, recently President Trump tweeted about shutting down the southern border in response to the approaching caravan. Whether or not he has the authority to do so, we turn to Kristine Huskey, who teaches law of armed conflict and national security at the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona. When the president tweets, "I will call up the U.S. military and close our southern border," legally, can he?
I think he can legally close the ports of entry to people coming in.
Can he place military between ports of entry as a presence there to say, this is stopped and closed, you cannot enter?
I think he cannot use the military to enforce the law and engage in a law enforcement function, such as standing there and being the wall themselves, and then perhaps engaging in physical activity, whether it's shooting people or something else. That would be a law enforcement function, much like a sheriff or police would do.
The President of the United States also functions as Commander-in-Chief, so he can activate the U.S. military in this case. That's correct?
He can absolutely activate the U.S. troops, military troops.
When we have military troops on the border, can they function in the capacity of what we think of right now, Border Patrol, U.S. Customs, ICE officers, etc., law enforcement?
Well, so they cannot. They cannot engage in law enforcement functions, and there's a 1878 Act that prohibits that. Basically, our U.S. military troops from engaging in domestic law enforcement in the U.S. And by law enforcement functions, we mean things like apprehension, arrest, search and seizure, interrogation, and detention. And that is what we have CBP doing at the border. So U.S. troops cannot do that directly.
When you're Commander-in-Chief and you have word and intelligence that tells you there are thousands of people from a foreign nation approaching your border, for some it may seem reasonable to have that national defense present and visible on the border. Is that accurate? I think that it
does seem reasonable when you phrase it that way. Of course, there are thousands, although the number is dwindling, of foreign nationals coming to the U.S., but they are not coming to invade the country in the legal sense of the word. They're not coming to undermine the authority of the United States. In fact, they're coming for the protection of the United States. They very much want the authority of the United States to protect them.
You've mentioned this word a couple times now. Let's clarify then the meaning of invasion, because it has been used rather loosely perhaps throughout these last few weeks. What exactly is an invasion?
Well, if you actually look it up in the dictionary, it really means an armed group. It could be a military force of another country, or it could be a loose militia, a non-state armed group, which comes into a country or tries to come into a country to undermine the authority of that country, or to overthrow the government, or to change their laws.
Recently, Yuma Sector Border Patrol provided night vision video of their border. You could see dozens of people just hopping over the fence into the United States, which is common. However, it's happened much more frequently lately, and the numbers have increased. As we know, there's been a sudden influx. Doesn't that do enough for a Commander-in-Chief to say, something is happening down there, I must do what I have to do to stop that presence? Just the physical act of jumping over the border as opposed to applying for asylum or standing at the port of entry and making that request?
I believe the language really goes to undermining the authority of the United States. So you could read it. I know, again, you're going to hear more about this, and people will be parsing this language. When it's an unlawful obstruction that's against the authority of the United States, or an assemblage that's against the authority of the United States, or a rebellion against the authority of the United States. So it goes back to troops can be used to repel not just an invasion, but an assemblage. Now, this, of course, is an old act, so of course the language is antiquated. But assemblage is, a group of people, right?
And it still applies, though. This is a group of people.
This is a group of people, but they are not coming to go against the authority of the United States.